and I'm greatly pleased and honored to introduce tonight playwright Tina Howe, here with the generous support of the Haas Foundation's Evelyn Danzig Haas Visiting Artist Program, established this year at Wheaton. The list of Tina's plays, honors, and awards is very long and needs no introduction. Her most recent plays are Rembrandt's Gift, Two Small Hands, and a translation of Ionesco's The Bald Soprano. The spirit of her drama is joyfully defiant, created in the zone between dreams and consciousness, dizzy with language born underneath the words in a million buzzing cells. When asked to write a play last year in commemoration of September 11th, Tina chose to open her disorderly conduct with a typically eclectic group of New Yorkers looking up in awe at the Twin Towers, not burning as they were last year, but on August 7th, 1974, when Frenchman Philippe Petit walked back and forth across them on a tightrope 7 times. This is Tina's artistic vision, a determined celebration of human possibility. Please welcome my teacher and friend, Tina Howe.
Thank you. They said, don't step on the microphone. I can do anything but step on the microphone. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm particularly thrilled to have been invited by Charlotte. One of the joys of teaching is having students that are much smarter than you are. And it's always a little daunting the first time one of these students who's smarter than you are appears in your class, because they're invariably encased in a great shaft of light, which may or may not be visible to the rest of the class. But I have learned through long experience that rather than try to spar with them and try to equal them and tantalize them, you draw back in awe and you let them shed their light unencumbered with any help from you. This isn't the first time that I have been invited by a student who has turned into a professor to come and visit her students. I have to tell you that I am a product of experimental schools. I went to an experimental high school connected to the University of Illinois called University High School. And then I went to Sarah Lawrence. I have never studied theater. I have never taken a playwriting course. I don't know what restoration comedy is. I have never read a play by Marivaux. I am totally uneducated. So just so that you know the kind of person you're going to be hearing from. I came of age at a time when there weren't writing schools, and when you wanted to sort of find your voice and explore and become an artist, what you did was you went to Europe and you drank a lot of wine and you did outrageous things and you learned other languages and you did your work in opposition to this country by being in another country. And so it was really in Europe that I sort of first developed my sense of who I was as a writer, and not in the academy. And I now teach myself, and there's always that part of me that feels for you students, that feels, oh my, this is so arbitrary. You know, here you are all gathered together and you're given certain assignments, and it's only because you're in the room together that you have these assignments, and you know, certain among you are singled out as the gifted ones, and others are the catastrophes and are, you know, that they're avoided in social situations. And I think this is so difficult, and how, you know, how do students manage this? How do they manage the arbitrariness of it all, and the fact that on a certain day everybody has to hand in work, and you know, there are certain rituals that we keep repeating in the classroom. But then I think that what you have in a classroom that I never had was you have community, and that you have each other, you have an audience, you have somebody to write for, you have somebody to hear your work, to critique it, to reflect it back to you. And me and all of my experimental years and going off to Europe, I never had that. I never was part of a community. I never had a mentor. So many of my playwriting friends talk about the great mentors they have, and there's always that part of me that is so envious that I never had anyone cheering me on. But part of that was because I was a very bad student, and I wouldn't have had a teacher do that anyway. But so as I stand here before you, there's a part of me that feels like a total imposter because I don't have any academic credentials. I did manage to graduate from college, but that's it. I mean, I never did an MFA or a QXR or a LYBLT or any of that. I just wrote my own plays. So if we were to have a pop quiz at the end of this little talk, I would fail and you would all get glowing grades. But I suppose I'm not here to talk about my learning or my lack of it. I wanted to give you this speech that I have given many times. I have given it for 3 people at a YMCA in Long Island. I have given it for 200 rabid women in the South. I have given it in Grand Central Station to homeless people. It is a speech that I love to give because it's all about the thrill and the danger of writing for the theater, which is something that I am deeply involved in and something that I care enormously about. So let me begin. I was saying to Charlotte and the nice man with the big smile before that I'm feeling sort of depressed and vulnerable these days as a playwright because I'm a Tony voter, which means that I get invited for free to everything on Broadway, and it's not been a terribly good season. And at moments I despair because the work is not terribly good. And so Charlotte and the man with the wonderful fox, that was his name, they said, oh, begin with the danger, don't begin with the thrill. And I always begin with the thrill, but the danger is really the best part of it. So I think I'll save the danger and I'll begin with the thrill, even though the danger is in a way more interesting. Of course, the thrill of writing for the theater, among other things, is that what I do is seen in the dark. And there's something about people filing into a room and everybody turning out the lights and the audience sitting there in the darkness, knowing that what they are about to see is pretend, and knowing that they know that it's pretend and that it's all about mimicry and powders and costumes and lights and illusion. And the fact that they're called plays. You know, I think one of the reasons that playwrights tend to be abused so much by the critics is because, you know, they see us as people who play, unlike novelists and poets who do more sustained, serious work. But there's something about how ephemeral our art form is, and also the fact that it is done in the dark, and that it's not, it's all illusion, and it's all, in a sense, fake. It's all pretend. And that's part of what I love about doing this, because you can't really touch it. You can't really, you know, now you see it, now you don't. A number of my plays have been published in anthologies, and for my last one, I very much wanted a photograph, one of Christo's photographs on the cover. Christo, that wonderful Romanian who wraps buildings and sea coasts and islands and so forth and so on. And I wanted one of his covers, one of his pictures on my book of plays. And a friend of mine knew him, so I was able to contact him and ask if I could borrow The Running Fence for one of my covers. And indeed, 2 weeks later, I got this package with all of these negatives saying, oh yes, please, you know, take whatever you want, just give me credit. And I was so bowled over that he gave these so willingly, you know, and so freely, and didn't charge me any money for them, that I wrote him this rabid love letter, which my husband said I couldn't send because I would be committed to an institution, because my enthusiasm was so out of control. So I tore it up and then wrote a much more chaste letter and included it with a beautiful white amaryllis plant. And in the letter I said, I suppose it was sort of arrogant, I said, well, actually, Christo, you and I do very much the same thing, that we create this spectacle that exists for, in my case, 2 hours, and then it's over, and yours exists for 2 weeks, and then it's over, and that both of us are about concealing and revealing, and I made all of these, I thought, terribly intelligent similarities between the two of us. And I think they were so intelligent that 2 weeks later, this enormous mailing cylinder came, as tall as me, with a great big lid, and I unscrewed the lid and peered inside, and inside were 9, count them, 9 signed Christo posters. And then the dilemma was, do I take these posters out of the cylinder and hang them on the wall, or do I get in the cylinder and just sort of live there with the posters? But I've always felt that part of my admiration for Christo has to do with the fact that what he does is so ephemeral, as is what I do. That, you know, people come into the dark and they know that it's all bogus, and that the audience is willing to surrender to me. There's something just extraordinarily galvanizing about that. Also, the whole ritualistic aspect. If you have a play run, which I have been lucky enough to experience, Coastal Disturbances ran for a year, Painting Churches ran for about 8 months. And if you're writing close to yourself, and if you're writing about old aches and old torments and old anxieties, and if you sort of sneak back into the theater where the play is running that is dealing with these subjects, and you sneak in over a period of time, and you see that, in fact, the story comes out differently in the play than it did in real life, and there's something, at a certain point, the ritualistic aspect, that repetition, that night after night, you know, Tina's story is told over and over again. Of course, she's not called Tina, she's called somebody else, but at a certain point, this sort of marvelous exorcism happens, that you get over whatever it was that you thought was bothering you, and that the play becomes more real than the actual pain that made you write it in the first place. And I find that whole aspect of repetition very intoxicating. I think more than anything, the thrill of playwriting has to do with the fact that you get to rewrite your past and you get to decorate your fantasies. And what other profession allows you to do this? I'm always struck after Painting Churches, so many people said, is this autobiographical? Which is such an odd question, because if you say yes, then they say, well, where's the art? And if you say no, then they say, well, you're pulling our leg, and how can we believe you? It means that it's fakery, and you know, where do you stand on this? And so with that play in particular, I developed this rather coy, meaningless little response, which was, it's all true, but none of it happened, which sort of doesn't mean anything, but it got the journalist to be quiet and not bother me anymore. But what I think is so much more revealing is not so much whether you're writing about the events in your life. I mean, you know, we all live more or less the same lives, but what makes each of us unique are our fantasies, what we dream about, what goes on inside of our heads. And that's what you get to explore as a playwright. That's what you get to put on the stage. So that to say, is this autobiographical, to me is not the question to ask, because it's much more interesting to know what's going on in somebody's head than to look through their photo album and see their baby pictures and hear the dates of, you know, when they got married and when they bought their first house. And in this same spirit, if you are writing close to yourself, you have this tremendous power to alter yourself. And because I'm a New Englander who's into self-flagellation and humiliation, there's nothing I enjoy more than making a fool of myself and seeing myself as a complete idiot. So my favorite of my plays has always been The Art of Dining, because there is this deeply pathetic Tina figure in the play who doesn't know how to eat and doesn't know how to talk and keeps spilling food all over herself. And I can't tell you how much I enjoyed that. Sitting in the audience, watching Diane Wiest night after night, staggering out onto the stage of the public theater, spilling her soup all over her dress, and then getting wiped clean by the waiter, and crawling on her hands and knees to the ladies' room, and being completely undone. And there was some part of me, oh, I know what it is. I know what it is. If you can laugh at yourself before somebody else does, that's what it is, then you're safe. So it was like me saying, you know, I know that I'm a ludicrous person, but I know it better than you, and I can be funnier about how ridiculous I am than you can. And so, you know, it's a way of sort of taking the heat before somebody else humiliates you. I think that was sort of at the bottom of it. By the same token, if for a moment you're feeling particularly glamorous and sexy, then you can create a more glamorous sort of sexual image of yourself. And for 5 minutes in my life, I was in a triangle with a man on either arm saying, "Come with me." 5 minutes, mind you. It didn't last longer than that. It was a very, very short period of time. But it was so exciting. Me, no, me, and you know, oh. And I don't know, when I was in my late 40s or 50s or however old I was then, I was suddenly remembering the fever of being torn in half by two sublimely, deliriously wonderful men. And I thought, I want to stop time and hover over that pull. And I want to write about a woman who was torn between two men, and I'm going to make her wildly beautiful and wildly seductive. And indeed, Annette Bening was cast in the role for Coastal Disturbances, and Annette was in this triangle, but it was me. It was me, it wasn't her. You know, so night after night, there she'd be on the stage with Tim Daly on one side and Ron Gutman on the other with his French accent. "Oh, come to me, honey Denzel, you are so beautiful." And Tim with his muscles and his golden skin and all of that sand and everything. And there I would be, sort of sitting in the back going, yeah, that's me. So, you know, if you have a chance, if you have an opportunity to put those 5 minutes when you were in a triangle on the stage and get these beautiful actors to take the parts, you know, that is sort of awesome stuff. And then, I mean, with something like painting churches, you know, to take it a step further, oh, this sounds so pathetic, but, oh dear, it does sound pathetic. Well, see, I have an older brother, and there's this thing of the loved child and the unloved child. Oh, it's so boring. But he was the guy, and he was beautiful, and you know, the successful. Well, actually, he screwed up a lot, but he was magnetic and beautiful and charismatic, and I was tall and creepy and thin and strange. So that my parents sort of couldn't see me because it was all about my brother, who went to Harvard and did all the things, although he was a bad boy and did other things that weren't so great. But, you know, he was the man and he was the golden one, and I was sort of under the table melting my crayons and trying to go, hello, here I am. And that was sort of my lifelong stance, which I seem to be still doing today as a playwright in some way. But anyway, because I had such a difficult time being seen and appreciated, obviously at some point, I mean, once my parents had died, the thing was to write a play in which I am not only seen, but I am embraced. And to do that, I mean, I can't tell you how liberating that was. And of course, what happens, because when you are the unloved one, you tend to feel that the people who aren't loving you are hateful and horrible and wicked and less than human. But as I wrote the play, I realized, on the contrary, that they were very human. They were just sad. And they had terrible, you know, heartbreak to live through and to uncover and to you know, to sort of carry around with them every day. And in the course of writing the play, I began to understand that. And then in the first act was all very much from the Tina character's point of view. And then in the second act, it was very much from the parents' point of view. And by the end of the play, because she's trying to get them to hold still so she can paint a picture of them, which in the end they finally admire, which in a sense was my metaphor for writing a play about them. You know, I was creating an artwork that, of course, they were dead, but that the assumption was that they would admire the artwork, and that's, well, they say all art is revenge. So, you know, I wrote this play in an effort to get them to see me and to appreciate me, and in the play, they do. So, I mean, for those of you who are thinking of going into engineering or going into accounting, think twice, because you could be in a situation, if you studied playwriting with Charlotte, where you could sort of put your life down on the page in the form of a play, and you could change things so that in the end you are loved and you are heroic and you are being pulled by the two beautiful men on either side. And of course you can go much deeper. I mean, I'm being obviously rather superficial. I do write plays that are more serious than that as well, but I just wanted to give you a sense in terms of how you can sort of alter your life and how you can make it artful and how you can turn it into a work of art, that there's the power. And I think in terms of the thrill of writing for the theater, to me it's that power of seeing an audience filing into a theater, people you've never seen before, seeing them put down real money, seeing them put down their credit cards. I remember once being in the Lambs and this woman said, 4 for Tuesday night, and the guy said that'll be $250, and I thought, oh my God, to see my play, it was just unbelievable. And these strangers file in, and they all sit in the seats, and then suddenly there are the workings of your mind up on the stage, so that it's a very heady art form in that regard. I've been particularly lucky, I think, in terms of, part of the thrill of my career has been, what dooms me and what makes me is my gender. You probably know that only 7% of most plays that are produced in this country are by women. And so women are still something of an oddity, and I'm still called a woman playwright. And because of my gender, I tend to write plays about women and about female experience. And because I write about women, I have been very lucky in terms of the actresses that I've gotten to be in my plays, from Diane Weiss to Kathy Bates to Jane Alexander, Cherry Jones, and Mary Beth Hurt, that I have really been able to work with the best actresses in the country. So there's that as well. There are the words, there's the landscape, there's the world that you create, but then there are these extraordinary artists that you get to work with. And I remember being at some speech for, Julia Miles, for the Women's Project, and there were 400 women in the audience. And at the end, the question and answer, somebody said, "Oh, how did you get to be so successful?" And I sort of was looking around to see who they were talking about, and then I said, "Well, if you perceive what I have as success, I would have to say it's because of the actors that I've worked with, and it is a collaborative art form, and I think women haven't really been heard from yet fully, as fully as they can be." And so women playwrights tend to be pushing the envelope in terms of how we write plays, in terms of how deep we go. And so you get an actress like Cherry Jones to be 90 in scene 1, 10 in scene 2, 90 in scene 3, 15 in scene 4. That's very heady stuff. So, I think for me the whole sort of world of being in the theater is about being able to explore my own artistry, my own demons, and to be able to explore them with enormously gifted people, and that there's there's nothing like that. A novelist may have at the end of the day their book in their hand, which is self-contained, but the playwright does have those exquisite moments of collaboration where you work with with marvelous actors and directors. So that's pretty much the thrill part. Now I'll get to the danger part. To me, the biggest danger or pitfall about writing for the theater has to do with what a cruel art form it is. Because a play can only be as good as the ideas within it. And a good play, no matter what style it's written in, really depends on its architecture. And so to craft a play, you have to be very sensitive and smart about structure, and you have to be very smart and sensitive about how you put it together and how you build it and the shape of it and the tone of it and how you want the audience to feel as they're watching it, how you want them to feel when they exit the theater. You have to be a craftsperson, and you have to be extraordinarily vigilant and extraordinarily precise as you create this architecture. But then when it's time, when you've sort of figured out the shape of the thing and the ideas of it and the themes of it, but then when it comes time to write the play and to put the characters in it, you have to surrender to the confusion of the characters, and you have to let the characters be inarticulate, you have to let the characters fall mute, you have to let the characters say the wrong thing, you have to let them be lost, you have to be lost along with them. So on the one hand, you have this gorgeous architecture and this beautiful chateau in the Loire Valley with all of these turrets and little windows and drawbridges and moats and chandeliers and trapdoors. But on the other hand, you have these characters who often are more inarticulate than they are articulate. Because, as we all know, the worst thing that you can have in the theater is characters who are self-aware, who come out and explain everything about them so that there is no room for you, the audience, to move into their skin and to sort of join their situation with them. I remember during a rehearsal of Painting Churches, this was early on, and Marion Seldes, who was playing Fanny the mother, was doing a very emotional scene, and she was working on it with Carol, the director, and she was going all out in tears and throbbing veins and sweat and the whole thing. And I'll never forget Carol saying, Marion, you've got to leave room for the audience. And just as Marion has to leave room for the audience, I have to leave room for the audience. And I think it's that very ephemeral kind of thread of bringing an audience with you, but giving them enough room so that they can inhabit the play themselves. And I remember reading this great line that Martha Graham had about one of her dances that she had choreographed, and she said, "When the Navajos weave a blanket, they always leave in a hole to let the soul out." And my feeling has always been that theater exists over that hole. That those of us who practice these black arts, that we are hovering over that hole that lets the soul out. So that, as you get this great idea for a new play that is just going to, explore every truth that has never been explored before, you can't let the characters be aware of that. And you can't let the audience know how smart you are. It's all about the heartbreak, and it's all about the things that can't be expressed. So often in class, the first class, I ask everyone as they go around the room, aside from telling me what food they hate and what food they love, to tell me of a moment in a play that changed their life. And 9 times out of 10, it's a silent moment. It's a moment where nothing is said. It's a look. It's a gasp. It's an inability to speak. And I think that is very much the world that we traffic in, the world of behavior. that isn't necessarily about language. So as you're sculpting this wonderful edifice, you have to be able to put people who can't speak inside of it, or people whose speaking is thwarted, or people who don't say what they are trying to say. So it's a very cruel form. And as a teacher, I teach playwriting at Hunter, and the most common mistake, or whatever the word is, the fault that young writers tend to have is they have the characters get up and explain everything, so that there's no mystery involved. And the less you reveal, the more the audience can participate, and it's this very strange balance. I think, there's a reason that the theater isn't as exciting as it could be these days, because, I think that as Americans, we're very into realism and holding a mirror up to what we perceive as being typical and familiar. And in fact, that to me is not really what the deeper sources of theater are about, which go back to, those moments of confusion and trying to understand the nature of things. And if you're dealing with sort of existential questions, language often fails. One of my favorite contemporary plays is Pinter's Betrayal, about this hopeless triangle of these lovers. And if you look at that play, most of it is panted or sighed. There's very little language in that play. There's a lot of sort of silent emoting, and there are a few sort of dizzy monologues, but not the usual kind of monologues that are full of complicated ideas, but more cries for help. So I think for those of us who are trying to mimic the sounds and the feelings of what it is to be alive in the 21st century, we have to discover this new vocabulary. But God help us if we don't put it in a shape that is coherent. So I think that's a tremendously daunting task, just in terms of of how we write our plays, how we shape them. Another danger to me is, and I don't know if you'll agree with me on this, but I think that theater by its nature is a conservative art form, because, and I've been in the commercial theater, so for me it's all about, if I want to make my living, I have to sell the tickets. And if I want to sell the tickets, that means that the audience has to immediately get it, which means that I can't be too far ahead of the audience, I can't play tricks on them. It means that I more or less have to fulfill their expectations. And there's that part of me, because I spent that wonderful year in Paris in 1959-60, the year that Ionesco's Rhinoceros came out, the year that Genet's The Blacks came out, and I've always been much more drawn to avant-garde work, and particularly the work of Ionesco. When I came back from Paris and saw how Ionesco was really turning our ideas of identity and power on their head, and I thought, oh, well, I should do this for women. Nobody's ever done this for women before. And so I wrote a play about women in courtship and how they compete with each other for men. And in the course of the play, one of the women takes off all of her clothes and jumps into a wedding cake and is licked clean by her would-be groom, and the critics were appalled, and the play closed in one night. And it was very clear that Tina exploring issues of power and identity for women in a Ionesco-like way was not allowed. And then my next play, Birth and Afterbirth, which was about the way women compete over their fertility, because my husband and I waited for 5 years before we had children, and so many of my friends would say, Tina, you're not a woman until you have children. And I just found that so deeply offensive. And I thought, somebody's got to write a play about this. And so I wrote a play about that, and nobody would touch it for 23 years. And that's because my techniques and my vision were frightening to, the general audience. So that's a problem. If you really are a trailblazer, if you're a rebel, if you want to smash things and create new order, I'm not sure that the theater is the best place for you. And because I think in the commercial theater anyway, if you're dependent on selling tickets, you've got to be in sync with that audience. And when I'm in despair and when I'm feeling, oh man, this is just too hard, what I tend to do to get re-inspired is to go to art shows, not the theater, because it seems to me that in the visual arts there is much more freedom within the form. And I remember during the minimalist stage, there was a show at the Whitney of this guy who had a pad of gray felt that he put on the floor of this enormous gallery in the Whitney. And what he did was, he came into the room, it was completely empty except for this pad of this felt, and he had a pocket full of ball bearings, and he threw them on the floor. That was the show. The randomness of how he threw them. And 2 weeks later, he would come back, he'd gather up all the ball bearings, and he would re-throw them. And there was a part of me that thought, oh, if only I could write a play like that. If I could just sort of throw the characters in the middle of a room and let them be random, and then gather them up and throw them in another configuration. But I knew if I did that, the critics would run out of the theater screaming, and probably nobody would produce it in the first place. There's also a wonderful show down in Soho by Walter de Maria, The Earth Room, that is just an L-shaped room that is filled with chocolatey, brown, aromatic earth. And you walk in, and there's a little door that's glass, so that up to your waist, so that you can see the dirt, that it's not a trick, that indeed it does go up, 3 or 4 feet, and you can look out over it. You can't walk in it, but you can look out over it. And the thing about that show is how quiet it is. That it's the earth and the ripples that it makes along the edges of the, as it's piled up, the edges that it makes, and the designs that it makes, and how aromatic it is. And I think, oh man, if I could get that basic, which I suppose Beckett comes the closest to doing that of any writer that I can think of. But, for those of us who have sort of an experimental tangent, oh man, if you want to make a living, the theater is really tough in that regard. And so much of my career has been about walking that fine line between, there's this other speech that I give about, wearing white gloves or bare hands. And the minute I put on my white gloves and do my waspy thing and write about alcoholic New Englanders who basically don't have any power anymore, and who talk about the good old days, eccentric Brahmins who walk along misty beaches and recite poetry and talk about the good old days at Harvard. These characters are very easy to patronize because they don't have any power, and they are eccentric, and they are peculiar, and they are odd. And so the audience sort of looks at them as if they're at the circus with dancing poodles and singing walruses, and they look at these sort of disaffected Brahmins who drink too much and play charades and play croquet, and everybody feels vaguely smug and superior to them. And those plays of mine tend to do very well. And not that I don't feel with them, and not that I don't invest myself in them, but I'm very aware what I'm doing when I write my waspy plays. And I tend to do a waspy one, and then I do a naughty one. And invariably, the naughty one either won't be produced or it gets attacked. But then I know, well, I will go back and I will, put on my white gloves again, and I will, get out my cocktails and have my Dubonnet and, go down that road again. And I'm always very aware as a woman of traveling that road. And I think many of us, maybe it isn't just women. I was thinking, if you'd like, you could ask me questions at the end, or I could ask you questions at the end. But it seems that so many of us have to adopt a certain persona, the waspy playwright, the gay playwright, the Hispanic playwright, and that we sort of, that protects us in some way. And I think women have to do that more than the guys have to do it, but there's a part of me that rebels most ferociously against that, because I find it's so limiting. But that is, alas, a fact of the theater, that in terms of the numbers, that most theaters are run by men, the critics are men, and only something like 7% of new plays that are done, are written by women. So if you are writing from the fullness of your experience as a woman, some of the artistic directors aren't going to understand, and some of the critics are going to be a little dismissive of you, and that's hard, and you have to figure out ways around that, and you have to be sturdy, and you have to not despair, and you have to be versatile, and you have to change your name even sometimes, and do work under a pseudonym. But that to me is a very real danger. My own gender has always been a problem. I think another problem in the theater is that, for whatever reason, critics seem to forget that playwrights have a body of work. So that when somebody like Tennessee Williams came out with a new play, it was as if he had never written his other masterpieces, and that when the later work was reviewed, it was like, well, what is he doing? This doesn't remind me of Glass Menagerie or Streetcar Named Desire. He's trying new things in here, and Edward Albee suffered terribly. He came out of the gate with the Zoo Story and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and then he had his angry plays and was in the Howling in the Wilderness for years and years and years, and nobody would give him a good review, and he suffered that feeling of betrayal, because he still has his gifts. It's just that he is going in new directions, and there is this thing that somehow playwrights are free game, and you want to see a bitter man, you should hear Arthur Miller sometime. I've been on panels with him, and you should hear him. If I wrote Death of a Salesman today, nobody would produce it. I mean, he's very bitter about the whole climate on Broadway and how his work, because he deals with political issues and far-reaching issues, that people are only interested in entertainment, and he is a very angry man. He's still writing plays, God bless him, but it's as if, he had no past, and that those great plays that he wrote, when he was a younger man, are forgotten. And that's when any of us have a new play opening in New York, we are all in a state of absolute terror, because we don't have that sort of backing behind us. It's as if. And maybe it is because we work in the dark, and maybe it is because it's all powder and illusion, that when we turn around, there's nothing there, not even a shadow. So that is something of a problem. Maybe I should end by telling you the worst thing that ever happened to me that probably ever happened to anybody in the theater, in terms of danger. This is really awful. Okay, hang on. Okay. This is the worst theater story that you are ever going to hear, I promise you. I was doing this play, The Art of Dining, at the Public Theater, it starred Diane Wiest and Kathy Bates and Ron Rifkin, and A.J. Antoon was the director. And the play was written in the 70s, and it took place in a restaurant, because I couldn't help but notice in the 70s that when people went to eat out, it wasn't so much about eating as it was about theater. And that somehow diners got very confused about why it was that they were going to eat out together, because invariably when I'd go to a restaurant with my husband, we would encounter a scene, a couple breaking up, a couple consummating their love affair, every sort of theatrical, behavior that you could imagine, and enormous amounts of money being spent on meals. There was a time when, getting just an entree was $80, and things were totally out of hand, as if somehow eating was a form of theater itself, and that when you went to eat out, you would tell these. I remember hearing this incredible seduction story at O'Neill's, this Asian boy talking about how he'd been seduced by his Don at Oxford, and it was incredible, the detail being tied to the bed and the sheets and each article of clothing being ripped off, and my husband doesn't know how to listen to people. He just opens his mouth and stares, and I try to teach him, no, just look at me and keep your ears open. But this seduction, and clearly they wanted us to hear, because the detail was remarkable, and the volume was remarkable. And so I felt the time has come to really blur the lines between theater and fine dining. And so I wanted to set a play in a restaurant and I split the stage. Half the stage was the kitchen, where the cook is cooking, and the restaurant is run by this couple, and the woman is the chef, and her husband is the maitre d', and he serves the diners in the other half of the stage, which is the restaurant, and it's this wildly successful little restaurant. I made it up, of course. It just opened in New Jersey, and what I wanted to do was sort of explore, how do I put this, the theatricality of making food and of hunger and of consuming food, because my previous play, Museum, had been about how art is consumed, and I knew that I then wanted to write a play showing an artist at work and what that is like, what an artist goes through, and I was trying to think, aside from my fascination with restaurants, I think, to write about a writer is so boring because we just sit at a computer, but to write about a cook, there are all those sauces and all that chopping and all of those, pieces of meat flying around the room. So I figured this is perfect. I'm going to write a play. Half of it takes place in the kitchen and the other half with the diners consuming, so that we see the artists at work and we see the food being consumed. And I had dieting diners, and I had the Tina character, who was a short story writer who really couldn't eat at all, who was sort of the other half of the cook. They were, in fact, really the same person, because at one point Elizabeth was trying to get to the ladies' room, but she's so vain that she won't wear her glasses and she can't see, and she's on her hands and knees and she keeps crawling into the kitchen, and there's a moment when she and Ellen are face to face, and usually the actresses who play these roles figure it out that indeed they are the two sides of the same character. Anyway, sorry for going off on a little tangent there. So the play was all about our absorption with food and the lengths that we go to satisfy ourselves. And I wanted it to end with Elizabeth, the writer, finally making the diners aware that the reason we eat is to stay alive. And she has this speech at the very end. Ellen has, because her husband is so nervous about, the restaurant maybe losing money, he keeps overbooking and keeps making her cook more and more, and makes it impossible for her to really create as an artist. And she gets so frustrated that she turns off the lights, turns off the stove, and says, "That's it, I quit." And she shuts down. And meanwhile, the diners, are waiting for their second course and for their dessert. And there's this catastrophe in the kitchen. And they have this terrible fight. And they eventually make up. And Cal, sort of turns over a new leaf and promises he won't eat the food anymore. And I wanted the play to end with Cal bringing out this stack of crepe Suzette. And giving this dessert away to the diners for free, and to show them that indeed eating is something communal that you do together in a room, and that the crepe were already flaming. And I wanted this image of people standing around a fire, as it was in the old days. And the guy who lived across from us in our apartment building was a captain at Tavern on the Green. And he was a flamer in more ways than one. And he came and taught the company how to flame, because it's very dangerous, because you have a live flame on stage. And so he came and he not only taught the actor, because the actor had to pour this sauce into this pot that was already flaming a little bit, and then he had to teach the stagehands how to do it, so that to make the initial fire. So it was a very dangerous procedure that we were undertaking, and we knew that we had to really do this the right way. And so we had a whole day of flaming where the actors and the stagehands were taught how to do this, and everything was made very clear. Okay, so the play comes to an end. Cal and his wife make up, and he brings out this stack of crepe Suzette, and she is at the pot, sort of stirring the sauce, and there's this little flame going, and I wanted the diners to gather around this flame, and because it takes place in the winter, and some of the women have fur coats on, and I wanted them to put on their coats, and I wanted them to start eating with their hands and licking their fingers, and I wanted it to get a little primitive. And Elizabeth, in fact, as they are they don't get down on all fours and they don't start grunting. It doesn't get that bad, but I wanted to make it very clear that eating is not just about spending $150 on a meal, but it's about gathering around the fire and giving thanks for the kill and eating as a community together. And that was very important to me, that the Vivaldi be canned, we do away with the Baroque music, do away with everything beautiful in the set, and we go to something very simple and very primitive. And AJ and I couldn't agree on the degree to which this would happen. And for my taste, the ending was becoming more and more like a Hallmark card, with a little snowfall outside, artificial snow outside the windows, and the Vivaldi, and no sense of this being a communal feast, and nobody licking their fingers, nobody in a coat, and nobody sort of hunched over, no little tiny grunts, nothing, just everybody being very civilized. And we argued, and then we went up to Joe Papp's office and we argued some more, and finally AJ said, "Oh, give her a bigger flame. Give her a bigger flame. That'll take care of it." Okay, this was the third to the last preview. We had, 2 more previews and we were going to open. And the same night it was the opening of Peter Parnell's The Sorrows of Stephen. So Joe Papp was upstairs at the Martinson in his 3-piece white suit, and we were down on the Newman on the big stage. And so the moment came when Cal comes out with the crepe Suzette, and he gets his bottle of sauce and he pours it into the cauldron that already has a slight flame, and a sheet of fire leaps across the stage. Diane Wiest goes up in flames. Her hair goes up in flames. The spout from the bottle flies off, hits Bob Geringer in the head. Head wound, blood all over him, blood all over Jane Hoffman. Kathy Bates grabs an overcoat and throws herself on top of Diane, who is burning, and her hair, everything. The audience is, hey, whoa, man, oh, gee, boy, I didn't know Tina had it in her, man. This is really something. And, I'm watching my actors burn on the stage. And it was like, oh, man, I can't deal with this anymore. This art form is just way too dangerous. And then the cry went out, is there a doctor in the house? And then, this gasp, and people realized, oh my God, this is real. Within 5 minutes, the bomb squad was there because of the explosion when the bottle exploded. The bomb squad was there. The fire department was there. Dogs were there. television cameras were there, and Joe came down in his three-piece white suit from Peter Parnell's opening, and we all raced down to the green room, and there were all of these medics, attending to Diane, who had third-degree burns under her arms, and her hair, her hair just went up in flames, and a number of the other actors were, not as badly burned, because she had to stay in the burn unit for 3 weeks. And the others had more superficial burns, but Bob Garinger had this bleeding head wound. So I rushed down to the green room, and I'm thinking, that's it. I am going to give up this line of work. It's really too hard. This isn't for me. I no more of this. And I was, down there with the actors and the medics and all, and sobbing, as a matter of fact, in Peter Parnell's arms, as a matter of fact, who had his opening upstairs. And finally, they bandaged Diane, and she managed to stand up, and she had Joe Papp on one arm, and she had a medic on the other arm. And we came up from the green room, and we walked out into the lobby of the Public Theater, and there was the audience waiting for us, to see how we were. And as Diane and Kathy and Bob Garinger, bleeding and smoldering, walked out into the ambulances, the audience stood there clapping as this, procession of the wounded filed down to St. Vincent's Hospital. And I just thought, oh man, this, I thought that it was my fault. And I thought, well, because I had this apocalyptic, for me, I wanted this celebratory feast. I didn't want it to be Armageddon. I really didn't. I didn't want it to be destructive, but I did want something larger than life. I did want this celebratory ending, and I knew it would work like a charm. And so when the fire happened, I thought, it's me and my perverse imagination, and I did this. And I was terribly, terribly upset, and because I adored Diane, she'd been in another play of mine, and that she, of all people, was the one who was the most severely burned and in a lot of pain. And I would visit her every day, and about 2 days after the fire, I get a call from Joe Papp saying, "Okay, Tina, the show's going on." And I said, "You got to be kidding. I'm leaving town and I'm going to become a monk. This is it. And forget it." He said, "No, the show must go on. And we will do it with a lighting effect. We won't have real flame," because the actors, of course, were very freaked out. "We will have Diane's understudy go on, and we will just get back on track." And I said, I really don't want to do this. I think you should close the show. And he said, "I beg your pardon, Tina, this is my theater. I decide what we do in terms of a production, and we're going to continue with the play. And we will, we'll keep running it until Diane is healed and comes back, and then we will open the play." And indeed, 3 weeks later, Diane was well enough to come back, and I didn't want to be there, for her first rehearsal, being back with that lighting effect, because I knew it would be traumatic, which indeed it was. But it was a remarkable performance, and it wasn't quite the same with a lighting effect, but it was, it was a remarkable production, and she, with Diane, the flame is within her, so, that flame could never be extinguished. But so I guess in terms of danger and thrill, the theater can offer all of that to you. So I hope that this little talk has been instructive to you, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So I guess that's it. Anybody want to know anything? The secrets? Okay. Well, then we can go home and go to sleep. No, well, all the women weren't anorexic. I mean, there were 3 dieting women. One of them was played by Kathy Bates, who's hardly anorexic. It seems to me that women have a very, I was going to use a bad word, a very distorted relationship to food. A lot of women have real problems with food, and I was very interested in that, and I wanted to show, and I was sort of I was doing a comic turn about how women, deny themselves, how they starve themselves, and how they eat for each other and are thin for each other, and that whole competitive thing. And I just felt that was very much a part of the whole scene. I mean, if you live in New York and you go to really fancy restaurants, you see that so many of the people who go to the really expensive restaurants are very thin because they are always denying themselves. And I felt, if I'm going to write about food, I've got to write about the other side. So that's why I had those dieting women. And because I knew that I wanted Ellen, the cook, to be thwarted in her task, the idea, she's a cook trying to get the food out to the diners, and I thought, what a better way to obstruct this than to have her husband eat all the food, because he's so nervous about, is the place going to be a success? So that was just a sort of dramaturgical decision that he would eat the food, because then she can't serve it. So that was just kind of common sense. I went to Target today with yes.
When you're talking about this speech, right, or when you put on your silk gloves or your bare hands, when you're writing those slightly different plays or whatever, is there a difference maybe in the energy you feel while you're writing them, or how you feel before one of those plays go up in the theater?
Oh, I think I commit to the white gloved ones as firmly as I commit to the bare hands ones. I must say, when I do a bare hands one, I'm in abject terror when it comes to previews and the audience, and they tend not to do as well, and I know that, and I know I had a play in Louisville last year at this time, and I knew I was going to get attacked. I knew it the whole time. I was not fun to be around, because I just kept saying, I'm going to get killed, I'm going to get killed. And people would see me coming and they'd just say, go away, and don't catch your eye. But I give them my all, whether it's a well-behaved piece or not. But I think you'll find that most playwrights on opening night or waiting for the critics are in a state of terror. I mean, all of them, they really are. There's no avoiding that.
Play off that question, we were talking about the gloves and how you do something differently. Do you at any point feel like you stop by any means writing for you? Do you write all your plays for you, or do you ever write a play for the audience? Is there any?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a really good question. I write for them both. I write for the audience and myself, and I write for myself. I think I see them very much as being linked. I'm very aware of the audience when I'm writing. I'm very aware if I'm getting too wordy, or if it's too repetitious, or if it's too fey, or one of my problems is I dither a lot. I tend to get much too silly, and I dither and embroider. I'm very into embroidery, sequins and beads and feathers, and I have to watch that. So I'm always aware of how much an audience can take, and I'm always I have them in mind when I'm working. I was recently, my most recent play, and this was something brand new. I was commissioned to write a one-woman play for Elizabeth Franz, that wonderful tiny little woman who was in the revival of Death of a Salesman, playing Linda Lohman, and who was the original Sister Mary in Chris Durang's Sister Mary Ignatius Explains It All to You. She's tiny. And one of these people with a tremor And she's always on the verge of crying, but the tears never come, so that when she played Linda Lohman in Death of a Salesman, and she'd go, attention must be paid, and she'd hold in the tears, so everyone in the audience was weeping, because she's so powerful. And so Bob Moss said, would you take a commission to write a play for her? And I thought, wow, this is like writing for plutonium or something. And I said, sure. And then it was like, but what do I do? I mean, and then Bob said, well, Tina, historical plays are very in favor. Write about Madame Curie or Joan of Arc or, I don't know, Barbara Streisand. And I said, that's not what I do. I don't do historical. I work out my own demons, and that will make for a better play. And so, because of my thing about the loved and the unloved child, I finally wanted to put that to rest. So I wrote a play for Elizabeth. In fact, we go into rehearsal in about 3 weeks, in which she plays two sisters, the loved and the unloved. So she gets to be very glamorous and smart and in control as the first sister, and then to be a sort of a mess, but a sweet mess and a clown as the second sister. It's very interesting because I of course, it's a complete fantasy. I created this. They have this very famous mother who recently died and who was a monster. And it's sort of these two women recalling the same childhood but in very different ways. And it's very much about my own particular memories and pains that I had growing up. And I knew that for an actress, what an actress wants is a fully imagined script. So I figured the best gift I could give Elizabeth would be something really dense and full and emotional. And I'll give that to her, and then she can see how it fits. And if she doesn't like this or doesn't like that or wants to cut this, I will snip it to fit her. And I've never done this before, but I think when you have somebody who's as gifted as she is and who has the power that she does, I think you do sort of, it's easy for me to say this now. Maybe when I'm in the rehearsal room and she says, I want to cut pages 12 through 24, maybe I'll say, well, you think you want to cut that much? I may become territorial, but it's going to be really interesting. And I think the more I can write it for her, the better it's going to be. But I've never done this. I've never done a show for somebody. But, got to try it.
She seems to be making radically different choices for yours, not taking your advice. I wonder what would tell us about the work of your student, Charlotte.
Wait, say that again?
I want to talk would tell us about Charlotte Mead's work, since she seems to be making radically different choices from those you portrayed.
Yes. No, I was fascinated when Charlotte told me about being at Brown and studying with Mac Wellman and Chuck Mee. The play that she brought into my class was called Working, and it was, I would say it was written in code, beautiful code. It was like poetry. It was abstract. It was economical. It was unlike anything that my Hunter students were doing. And it was clear that different rules applied in terms of how we would talk about Charlotte's play, because the rest of the class tend to do more traditional, familiar kinds of work. And I think, that I feel what the teacher's responsibility always is to become a mirror, that I become a mirror that Charlotte looks into, so that she presents her play work to me and to the class, and I deal with it on the terms with which she's written it. So I don't say, well, this is written in code. I don't necessarily understand where you are. It's a poetic, there are certain abstractions, and I'm not sure I totally understand them, but my job is to surrender to them and to bathe myself in them so that I do understand them. And everyone in the class could tell that that Charlotte was very special, and that work was very special. And after it was read, dead silence, which is always so awful. And I don't like to be the authority and immediately jump in and say, well, in terms of, and I waited for the class, and nobody said anything because they didn't know what to say. And so I said, Charlotte, God, you have a voice. You have a voice. You have your own voice. And I remember a scene in A Revolving Door. Oh, this is so embarrassing because it was a couple of years ago. I should remember it better. Oh, yeah, wait. The boss, yeah. But it was, Charlotte was sort of writing about states of mind. And once I began praising what she was doing, then the class got into it. And they would say, wow, this is really cool, and how do you do this? And I don't quite understand exactly what it is that you're doing. But if the truth be told, I really admire Charlotte and what she does. And there's a part of me that wishes I had gone that route, because she writes truly original plays that come from her and her imagination, and I think there's something fearless about her. And I don't think she's as worried as I am about putting on my gloves. She may have gloves, but her gloves have the fingers cut out. I think I should go home after that. Oh, Lord, what does this say? The dial is the same color as the number, so I can never tell it. Is it almost 9 o'clock? I've been talking like for 3 days. You all have beards. I'm sorry.